Hello, everyone. So today we're going to look at some student samples of paragraph format for your research paper. And I want to keep review to a minimum here because I really want to dig into those samples and I want to try to keep the time of this video reasonable. But make sure review all those things we were talking about your papers and use their handout packet. Read through these pages multiple times. It'll help you write your paper. But if there's 2 pages of this handout packet that you need with you as you're writing more than any others, the first would be the MLA citation page, and you can look that up. I forget which page it is offhand, but you can go to past videos or just look in the table of contents here. And this is the second one, the paragraph structure. This is where students who've always done well in English might struggle a little bit. And it's a skill to learn, it's a process. And then, as I said, once you get to more advanced work, you might be able to play around with this process more. But for an introductory course, I want you to focus on using this formula on all of your body paragraphs of your paper. So everything except the introduction and the conclusion. And when I read your papers, when I grade your papers, I'm going to grade it on, are you using the research writing method? Okay, so last time we talked about evidence, it's your individual fact or quotation, paraphrase, statistic from a trustworthy source. It needs a clause before it and a citation after it, so part of you leading into it. We talked about analysis, which is breaking it down, explaining what it means, why is it important. Think of it as a court case. If you just throw the bloody knife in the room and run away, you're probably not going to convict. But if you explain each part of why that bloody knife's important, the fingerprints on the handle, the DNA and the blood, and then you might get closer and maybe have an expert talk about those things, right? Then you're getting closer. But if you add to it evaluation, how it fits in the bigger picture, the bigger context. Oh, this knife was found at the crime scene. It was the killer's favorite knife. It was, the position of it showed this. That would be evaluation, that bigger picture. So analysis, break it down, explain what does it mean, why is it important, and evaluation, how does it connect to the bigger idea. So you need to do that in every paragraph. And the structure looks like this. 1 through 5, and each of the 1 through 5 should normally be 1 to 2 sentences, with extreme cases where you'll see a third. Okay, so first the introduction to the idea being discussed, a general statement that does not need to be cited. Hip hop is becoming incredibly important in Japanese culture, right? That's a general statement that doesn't need to be cited. If I were to say were 2,746 hip hop albums produced in Japan this year, that would need to be cited. So that could not work as an introduction sentence. Okay, and it could be 1 to 2 sentences, most often 1. Then your evidence is the second part here. Remember to add your intro clause and a cite after. It's your bloody knife or your quote, paraphrase, statistic. Always needs to be a little bit of you, a clause or phrase leading into it. Then analysis, break it down. What's it mean? Why is it important? Talk about the important parts and evaluate it. How does it connect to the larger subject? And then connect back to thesis. Okay, and these are the steps that I suggested. Take your evidence, your quotation, your paraphrase, your summary, your statistic, highlight or circle the most important parts, and then begin asking analysis and evaluation questions. What does it mean? Why is it important? How does it connect to the bigger idea? Build your case. Explain to your jury the importance of that evidence. Okay. I recommend free writing based on those questions and answers, and then formalizing that into a paragraph. Okay, and keep your paragraphs to 1/2 of a double-spaced page. It could be a little more, a little less, But if you're a lot less, that means you're not doing all 5 of these thoroughly. And if you're a lot more, it means you're doing too much of one of these. Okay, so last time we went through an outline that a student had. We looked at these were the evidence sentences. They circled or highlighted or bolded the important parts. And then we broke down why things like landless laborers would be important, that they don't have power, and you need to explain that to your reader. Think of them as your jury that you're explaining it to. And we went through a lot of examples of that. So today I want to look at some student samples. Anytime I use student samples, they're imperfect. The studies show if I were to give you a perfect example from a published author, that it actually isn't a good educational tool. Instead, using student samples that are imperfect get us to think through problems that students actually have. And so as we go through these, I'll point out a couple of problems in each paragraph. I think almost all of them. And that way we can learn as we're going through the examples. Okay. So this first paper was on the animal welfare or treatment of animals, right? The introduction sentence, the sentence that says what this paragraph is going to be about, that's not a fact that needs to be cited, is the United States Animal Welfare Act focuses on the mistreatment of animals. Okay, that is a general idea or statement. It could be made even a little more vague or a bigger idea than that. And you could debate whether like that's just a provable fact, but it gives a general context that doesn't need to be cited, right? So I would say they could improve on that introduction sentence. Okay, so then evidence with a clause before it. These laws put into place address 3 ways unnecessary animal suffering can occur. And then the quote, so this is from the actual author here, right? And it leads into a quote from a source. And you can see it's about 2.5 lines. That's about the maximum that I want your quotes to be. When a given research protocol is not well justified scientifically, the amount of animal suffering induced by an experiment is not strictly required to conduct the experiment, or inappropriate animal handling, housing, and feeding practices. You see the MLA format here, the quote stops, then you have parentheses, last name, page number. Okay, so now this is your fact, and you can tell that the quote is from a journal. It reads a little bit more on the difficult side, right? And so that's why it's even more important for you to break it down for your reader. What does it mean? How does it connect to the bigger idea? And so here we have scientific justification in an experiment is important to reduce the number and unnecessary suffering of lab animals. Inappropriate handling or housing of animals will also contribute to unnecessary suffering of the animals and could skew the results of the experiments if a healthy vector is needed. Okay, so it's explaining why this is important, that if this is not followed, then this would happen, right? That it can contribute to unnecessary suffering of animals. And then she combines, you'll see this, you'll probably see this more often than not, evaluation with connecting to the thesis. That's fine. Or you could have it separate as well. The Animal Welfare Act contributes to the 3R principle as it reduces the mistreatment and suffering of lab animals for medical research. So we don't have her thesis here, but you can probably tell that her thesis has to do with arguing that the Animal Welfare Act is something that's important, as is the 3R principle. I think she was arguing, if I remember right, that that China should have something like the Animal Welfare Act, and that they should use this thing called the 3R principle, which she explains in other parts of her paper, right? The one thing I would say here that could be added in that last connect to thesis statement is she doesn't mention which country anywhere in that paragraph. And I think it would be important to identify the country. And so the things I would have her fix are make her introduction sentence a little more general, and a little more clear what that paragraph's going to say, and then make sure to identify the country somewhere in the paragraph, especially by the time you get to that last sentence. So it's good overall, but some small adjustments. Okay, so let's look at a different one. This is about space and the Chinese and American space race. When it comes, so the introduction sentence, the general idea. So what I always say about introduction sentences is that if you only read the introduction sentence of every paragraph in a paper, you should have a really good idea what that paper is about, right? So if you just read the introduction, conclusion, and then the first sentence of every paragraph, if that person's doing the introduction sentences right, then you should really know what that paper was all about. Okay, so here's the general idea. When it comes to space, NASA doesn't do military practices. When NASA was founded, it was meant for peaceful space research. Okay, so it's this bigger idea, bigger thought idea about NASA, right? I would say, same as the first one, that this could be slightly improved. Perhaps something about what it's going to compare it with, which is the CNSA, the Chinese version. So perhaps that would be good to have in that general introduction sentence. Okay, then he digs into evidence. And what you're going to see here is he uses 3 lines of evidence. This is tricky. I recommend not doing this. It is hard to do this well because you have to, each one of these 3 pieces of evidence, you then have to analyze, evaluate. And if you do that well for all 3, it's going to end up a monster paragraph that's 3/4 of a page or a whole page. So I do recommend breaking this up to maybe 1 or 2 pieces of evidence. Given that, he does a pretty good job. Okay, so here's his evidence. And in this case, he just paraphrases in his own words. The CNSA has both civilian and military components, with the military being the leading force. Since the CNSA is a 2-tiered civilian space and military space, that's how it's broken up, it's a secret which of them is really in control. NASA, on the other hand, has been purely made for civilian research and a benefit to mankind. Okay? Now, he does that really effectively. Those are short paraphrase sentences, and so it works well here. I always recommend less than 3, but when a student does it well, it can work. And you see the comparison and contrast there, right? You see the differences between the 2. Now he needs to explain, why is that important? What's it mean? How, and the bigger idea. And one thing I'll note here is that students often will ask, should I compare and contrast the U.S. and my country in one paragraph? Or should I do a paragraph talking about the U.S. side and then a paragraph talking about the Chinese side? It can be done either way, okay? Here you get a really effective approach where it discusses that compare and contrast both countries in one paragraph, okay? But it can be done either way. So here's his analysis explaining why that information he just presented is important. This is important because this could be done, this is important because this could be one of the reasons that the U.S. doesn't want to partner with the CNSA. It could also cause very different research in space, which could divide the CNSA and NASA even more. In the grand scheme of things, it could cause problems down the line for both space programs. If they assisted each other, it would cause less tension and greater friendship, so the U.S. would not be as threatened by the CNSA. Okay, that's pretty strong analysis, breaking down why that's important. And I would say this last sentence here could probably fit under analysis or evaluation in some ways. I think it does a little bit of the work of both. But that he in that short sentence, he analyzes, or in that short section, he analyzes all three pieces of evidence pretty well. So evaluation and connect to thesis. This seems to be the main reason that the United States bans cooperation with the CNSA. So if the CNSA would be a mainly civilian space program, then NASA and CNSA would be able to work together. Okay, so he's connecting and maintaining the thesis. So if you read this, you should have a pretty good idea what his thesis is about. So check the last sentence of every paragraph and say, if I just read that last sentence, would I know generally what the thesis is about? Here you can tell he's arguing that the CNSA should become civilian, and then NASA and CNSA could work together, right? That's in his thesis, and I think it's clear from this sentence. So again, could do a slight improvement on introduction. I normally recommend one or two pieces of evidence, but he does this well. His analysis and evaluation covers all three, so he fully breaks it down and connects to the bigger picture. And when you read his last sentence, it clearly you can understand what the thesis is. So it connects this paragraph to the thesis. Okay. Let's look at another one here. So introduction sentence, again, if you just read this, you should know what the paragraph's about. Comprehensive sex education is a right that should be taught in every school. When not taught properly, teenagers may engage in risky sexual behaviors that result in pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases. For this reason, it is unethical not to give teenagers accurate and helpful information about their sexuality. Okay, that's a long introduction section, huh? I like to show you the exceptions here, because I'm sure this could be done in one or two sentences, but I think the three works here, right? It is strong, it is clear. If you just read that, you know what the paragraph's about. None of it needs to be cited, right? And also, it makes a claim, and it does it with a strong declarative sentence, right? For this reason it is unethical. Notice it doesn't say, in my opinion, it's unethical, or I believe it's unethical, or I think. I believe, I think, in my opinion, those weaken your ethos or your argument, right? And so avoid using those, state declaratively. Okay, so that's a strong introduction, and it violates my 1 to 2 sentence rule, but it does it well. Okay, now evidence. According to Centelli, so that's the clause or phrase leading into the evidence, and that's enough. You could just do something as simple as that. It doesn't need to be huge or long. Of course, you don't want to say according to the author in every paragraph. Vary it a bit. But that's as simple as the clause from you needs to be. The quote just can't be on its own. Okay, access to complete and accurate STI, HIV/AIDS, and reproductive and sexual health information has been recognized as a basic human right and essential to realizing the human right to the highest attainable standard of health. Okay, so that's the evidence. Now we need to break it down. Why is that evidence important? Why is the bloody knife important? Right? So this is the analysis. The current policies in the US and Japan do not effectively teach students safe sex options. Instead, they just say that they should avoid sex altogether, which is not the answer. It causes more harm than it does good, leading to unintended consequences, such as pregnancy and sexually transmitted disease. Okay, so that clearly explains why that evidence is important. It's making the case to that jury of the importance of that. So now the bigger idea and connect to thesis, again, kind of done in one sentence. Let's see if it's effective. The purpose of sexual education is not to encourage teens to go out and have sex, but to inform them on how to safely practice it if they choose to have it. Okay, that does it. But I would suggest another sentence, doing it a little more fully. But that would mostly work. Again, you can clearly see what their thesis is from that, right? Basically, they're arguing in favor of sexual education. I think that's clear. And so that works. And you could argue a little bit of the analysis there was partially evaluation as well. Sometimes they blur together like that. So overall, this paragraph does a good job. It violates my introduction rule, but it does it in an effective manner. And from that introduction, you can clearly see what that paragraph is going to be about. It presents the evidence, it explains that evidence, and it connects to a thesis. You can read the last sentence and you clearly know what the thesis is. Okay, let's look at a fourth sample. So the general statement or introduction sentence. The second problem with the way an animator is treated in Japanese industry is with the number of hours they work. Okay, so notice it doesn't need to be cited. It's clear what the paragraph's going to be about. And just to show you how close it is to not being effective, though, say it said the second problem with the way the animators treated in Japanese industry is that they work on average 47 hours, right? And I made up that number. If you just change that, it would no longer work as an introduction because that number would need to be cited. It needs to be general, larger idea that does not need to be cited. And so here it works because they keep that vague. Okay, now the evidence, the fact, quote, paraphrase statistic with an introduction clause or phrase from you before it. Because animators are paid by a number of drawings done in a day, they are incentivized to work longer hours. On average, in between animators work for 10 hours and 30 minutes a day. This is longer than the average working day over the whole of Japanese employment. Okay, so there's your fact, your evidence. And so now I need to break it down. And here I think they combine analysis and evaluation. Normally, working more than 40 hours a week is seen as a lot, and these people are working anywhere from 60 to 70 hours a week. Normally, working this much wouldn't be seen as a problem because the animators who entered into those positions knew what they should expect in terms of wages. However, and so this is the maintaining thesis statement. However, when people are working this much and make less than the equivalent minimum wage, it becomes a humane issue, or an issue of being humane, it should probably say. So that maintaining thesis sentence works. I think you can tell what their thesis is, right? That basically argues that this type of work is inhumane. But I would argue that the analysis is a little bit ineffective here because it doesn't state it declaratively enough, right? Normally, it says normally, and then more declarative statement in the final sentence. So this idea that it's inhumane should probably be discussed a little bit in the preceding analysis sentences. Okay. Otherwise, it's a solid paragraph. I would say just adjust that analysis a little bit. Okay, so we have a couple more here. What I'll do is I'm going to go over these, but I would say at this point you have a pretty good idea of what this looks like. So if you did want to cut off here, that would be fine. But if you want to see me walk through a couple more examples, you can stick around and watch the rest of this. Okay, so here's another sample. Introduction. If you just read this, you should know what the paragraph's about, and it shouldn't have to be cited. One of the most effective ways China has been able to cater to its 1.7 billion people is through a 3-tiered system. Okay, there's problems there. So first it's incorrect. It's 1.3 billion people. And second, it refers to a very specific idea, the 3-tier system. Okay, so it needs to be more general than that. This would need to be cited. So you could say one of the most effective ways China has been able to cater to its large population is through through the structure of their healthcare system, right? And that would be more general, and that's something that doesn't need to be cited. Okay, so now their evidence. The first tier is basic coverage. The basic coverage is mostly sought after by villagers and civilians with low income. Second tier are clinics and hospitals with heavy populated areas. They assist those who are in need of serious medical attention and those who can't afford to go directly there for aid. The third tier of their system are what are specialist hospitals. Okay, so one note here. If you're using the same source multiple times in one paragraph, the second time with nothing in between, you could just do page number. So that would be just something to note there. Second, it's violating one of my rules that you have 3 pieces of evidence there, right? In this case, all 3 are tied really closely together. I would say it would probably be better if he just paraphrased all that into 1 or 2 sentences. But I think it could work. It depends, though. The question is, will they fully analyze all this information? Because that's a lot of information to analyze in 1 paragraph. So let's see. China has an efficient system because doctors and nurses of higher levels don't have to bother with simpler treatments like first aid and checkup. With such a large population, this makes sure resources are used effectively. Okay, so I would say this analysis starts it. It tells you why the 3-tier system is effective. But it doesn't analyze the differences in between these tiers. It doesn't tell you why that's important. And I think that's vital here. And so what I would suggest that this student do is break this into 2 paragraphs. Have 1 paragraph talk about each tier and the differences and how that's unethical or something like that. And it could even be 3 paragraphs. And then have another look more broadly like this. Okay. But I would say this evidence should definitely be broken up. Okay. And then maintaining their thesis. This is something the United States can learn from because often patients are overdiagnosed because doctors are used to dealing with more pressing matters in certain areas. Okay, that's clear. It's clear what their thesis is, right? That works. So the biggest thing here is this should be 2 to 3 paragraphs, and this evidence should be broken up. Okay. Student 6. Introduction sentence. If you read this, you should know what the paragraph's about. The biggest offender of homophobia thus far has to be the conservative legislation that is currently enacted in Russia. Okay. That is general enough. And it's a statement. Once you read, you know what the paragraph's about. I would say it's edging right up to something that needs to be cited, but it's not. It's just vague enough. That's it could be considered common knowledge, and it's general enough idea. Okay. So their evidence here, at the top of the list is the anti-gay propaganda law. This law intends to prevent the exposure of minors to non-traditional sexual relations. Okay. Now, this author, she's doing something a little different. And this is more challenging. I don't think I recommend it. But in a few circumstances, it may be okay. So what she's doing is, in 1 paragraph, she's given a piece of evidence, then analyzing it, then another piece of evidence, then analyzing it. We'll see how it works out for her. Okay, so why is that information important? What's it mean? Since the legislative body has decided that same-sex relationships and the depictions of them are dangerous to children, LGBT people are made out to be insidious threats to the youth. Well, that's extremely strong analysis. So far they're okay. So far that works. And then, for some reason, she decides she needs to add this other piece of evidence. This leads to the general public feeling aggression against the LGBT community has been sanctioned by the government. Right? So let's see how she analyzes that. It makes sense that those who commit crimes against same-sex attracted people feel they are in the right to do so given this information. I would say that could use just slight tweaks or twite sleeks, slight tweaks on that analysis, but I get what they're saying and it's close enough. Okay. So she presents the evidence, analyzes it as she goes. The only thing we need to see is if she connects it to the larger picture and maintains thesis. Without acknowledging that LGBT people are deserving of fundamental human rights, the cycle of discrimination and persecution will continue, endangering more people. Can you tell what her thesis is about? It's about LGBT rights, right? And that basically it's sanctioned by the government, punishment of LGBT people. And it connects to the larger idea and maintains the thesis. So it's good. So in this case, she does it in an unusual way, right? She breaks it up a little bit as she goes. Now, I would say this analysis, I think, is exceptionally well done, and it's well done in one sentence. If she had 2 to 3 sentences here for analysis and 2 to 3 sentences of analysis here, it would not work. It would become a monster paragraph. If you double space this, it'll be over half a page. It'll be between half and 2/3 of a page. So it is already on the edge of being too long. And so if there were more analysis, it wouldn't work. So this is done because she synthesizes the information really well in a brief way, right? Okay, last one here. So the general idea, if you just read this, you should know what the paragraph's about. Japan and the United States have similar statistics on the type of women who are more likely to pursue positions in government. Okay. So in this case, it's general. You can see it's wide. If you were to refer to specific statistics, it'd need to be cited. But it's general and it helps you know what the paragraph's about. So that works. Right? So let's look at the evidence. In this case, she paraphrases the evidence rather than quotes. So make sure it's in your own language if you're paraphrasing. This does create some more problems with representation, as the women who are likely to campaign or volunteer come from more privileged middle or upper class backgrounds, higher education, and tend to be housewives, older, or retired. Male politicians in Japan and the United States are less likely to want to nominate women for positions, suggest they run for office, or support them once they're in government. Okay, so clear evidence in paraphrase format. Matter of fact, I think if I remember right, she had some quotes and they were too long, so we had to change them to paraphrases to make it more condensed. Let's see if she analyzes and evaluates this thoroughly enough. Issues of equality amongst genders are not exclusive to Japan and the United States, but so-called developed nations have such a stark divide in support and representation is that much more striking. Okay, for all of this evidence, this is not enough analysis. Okay, need to break it down, like highlight the important parts, right? So if women are more likely to come from privileged middle or upper class backgrounds, you need to explain to your reader why that's important, right? What would be different if a working class single mother was elected over more privileged upper class person closer to retirement? How would that change perspective, right? So this is not enough analysis. This paragraph needs to be redone to add more analysis of this evidence, explaining what it would mean that men are less likely to nominate for positions. What effect would that have, right? So definitely this paragraph needs more specific analysis. Okay, evaluation and maintain thesis. If either of these two countries want a more active and more representative government, they need to acknowledge the gender biases that may prevent or deter women from joining government and work on solutions that that may allow for fair representation. Outstanding, right? That is evaluation. That's maintaining your thesis. You can tell what her thesis is about, right? So the big adjustment I recommended for her was more specific, precise analysis. She does everything else well. Okay, so hopefully those examples help you work through your paragraphs, but this is a hard process. You're going to need help. Reach out to me. We'll go through a Zoom session. I'll be commenting on every single thing you turn in, so read what I say very carefully. Put a question in the course questions if you have a question. If it's very specific or personal, then email me it. Make a Zoom appointment with me. I'll help in any way I can. Okay? This is a hard process. Try your best. Ask for help, and we'll if you put in the work now, the rest of the semester will be easier. Okay, thanks, guys.